Welcome back to the second part of Moses in Egypt, showing the Kabbalah and the Bible stories. We're going to start off with a little recap of what we learned in the first section. We learned that under Joseph, when Israel moved to Egypt, they lived in harmony with Egyptians, and they were one. They were living as one people. But when the old Pharaoh died and Joseph died, and Ramses came to power, he separated Israel and created a situation where Israel was enslaved, and so Israel is below and Egypt is above. Then Moses is born, and we find that he is raised as a Hebrew, but he's also later on raised as an Egyptian. And so he needs to be grouped. What is he? Is he Hebrew or is he Egyptian? And we find out that he is grouped as a Hebrew when he kills an Egyptian in order to protect his brother. In Judgement, we find that Moses runs to Midian, where he takes up with Jethro and his family and marries Jethro's daughter. It is at this point that he meets up with Jehovah and receives the directive to return to Egypt. Now, Moses at that point has experienced the three states of man. He has been raised as a slave, he has been raised as a prince, which will become a king, and he has also been raised as a priest under Jethro. We find also another strange thing. Aaron arrives in Midian, before Moses returns to Egypt. And we have to ask ourselves, did Aaron escape from Egypt, or are the Jews actually free to leave whenever they want? And if they're free to leave, why did they stay so long? Now, it might be the case that, at the current time they are being enslaved and forced to stay. And especially when Moses returns and asks that they be released, the Pharaoh is definitely loath to let them leave. But at this point, we have to ask ourselves, why are the Israelites still there? They were not enslaved during the famine. They still had all of their stuff, unlike the Egyptians. And so part of it is, how are they to be grouped? Are they Egyptians at heart? Do they look at Egypt as being their home? Or are they ready to really go home to the land of Canaan, which is now their home? So we find that Moses, on his way back to fulfill that directive, has a fight with an angel at an inn. And why? Because he hasn't circumcised his son. And so some part of Moses is still clinging on to those Egyptian ways. There is an old covenant between Abraham and Jehovah, and in it, every son of Abraham is to be circumcised, otherwise they're to be cut off from that nation. And so in order for Moses to go back and act as leader, he must circumcise his son. That circumcision is the last barrier between Moses being completely classified as a Hebrew. But we're not really too sure about those Israelites who have been living under these conditions for all of these years and have not made any attempt to go home. So when we look back at this time around, we understand that Kether is when there is unity, when things are looked at as one thing, as one complete thing. So Moses returns back to Egypt, and he goes to Pharaoh just as God commanded him to do, and he asks for the people to be let go. And Pharaoh responds by saying, no, I'm going to make their burdens heavier. I mean, obviously they don't have enough to do. They want to go out into the wilderness for 3 days. No. The answer is no. Instead, I'm going to make their burdens harder. And there's another opportunity for us to see exactly how Israel is responding to this, because they treat Moses, they say, hey, what are you doing? You're trying to mess up our good thing. You're trying to mess it up with Pharaoh here, as if Pharaoh's their buddy. But Pharaoh's not their buddy. So Moses goes back and he turns his rod into a serpent. And we find that the Egyptian magicians can do the same thing. And then something interesting happens as he's doing these first plagues. When he turns the Nile into blood and he brings frogs up out of the Nile, we find that these plagues cover everybody, both Egyptians and Hebrews. They're all treated the same. Okay? There is no difference between the Egyptian and the Israelites. They're all under these curses. When he gets to the third plague, however, when he brings lice up out of the ground, the Egyptians can't duplicate that. And it is at this point that they admit that God must be with Moses. This is the very last plague that affects all of Egypt, including Israel. Now we get to the above and below. And it's at this next plague of flies that God specifically tells Pharaoh through Moses that he's going to separate Israel out from Egypt now. Only Egypt is going to suffer these plagues. And so Israel is now considered above and Egypt below. When we talk about grouping by kind, we get all the way down to the 10th plague, and all the plagues have, from the 4th plague on, have just affected only Egypt. And now we get to the 10th plague, and we're back to everybody needing to do something. And in fact, if you want to be grouped as a Hebrew, you have to do something very specific. You have to mark your post with blood in order to avoid the death of the firstborn. Both Jews and Egyptians can do this. And if they do that, then they will be grouped as Hebrews, they'll be viewed as Hebrews by the angel of death and passed over. So the question is, are the people to be grouped as Egyptians or as Hebrews? And of course, their actions determine that. When we get to the kingdom part, or the denouement, the end result of all of these things that have happened so far, we find that Israel is free. The day after the 10th plague is done, Israel finds themselves in a free state. And many Egyptians convert and they say, hey, this God is real and I'm going with the Hebrews. Now we're going to talk about judgment and law as all in one step. And the reason being is that, there really is no written law here. It's kind of implied by what happens. And so when we look at the judgment side of things, Israel leaves, they're free to go because of what happened. And Pharaoh changes his mind. He says, hey, they're trapped between the sea and the mountains, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to put them back into slavery. Why did I ever let them go? And so he goes there and he finds that Moses has opened up the Red Sea and they're walking through. And he follows them in, and the judgment part is he dies. He and his entire army dies in the Red Sea. And so once the sea has closed up, there is no going back for the people of Israel. It isn't written there is no law writing and saying that, but it is implied because Pharaoh's dead, the army's dead. In the Bible it talks about how they looted the Egyptians by asking for their gold and silver before they left. They are odious to the Egyptians. There is no way that they can go back. So the end result is that they're free, but they must move forward. And this is just the beginning of another cycle of the Kabbalah. This is another cycle of classification, selection, isolation of what is the better model and what is below. And it just keeps going and going, as if God is looking for that perfect thing. He's trying to distill what is best in human beings. If you want to find out more about the Kabbalah or symbolism, prophecy, hidden meanings in the Bible, or Bible philosophy, please join us on Facebook under Jewish and Christian Symbology. Thank you, and we hope to see you again.